This review and analysis contains spoilers for the whole of The Rise of Skywalker from the outset. For complete openness, so you know where I'm coming from, I should mention that I personally strongly disliked both The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. It doesn't necessarily say much for The Rise of Skywalker then when I say at the start that it's easily my favourite of the sequel trilogy, but that does seem to be a minority opinion. The first thing I would like to praise about the film is just how pacey it is. It actually reminded me of Revenge of the Sith in this way. Both films have an awful lot to do within their runtimes and as a result of fast moving. There is a cost for this too that I think applies to both films. There is a sense that they're more of just a load of things happening rather than carefully structured stories. But I think this is only really a tick in the negative column if you insist on adherence to a typical structure. Revenge of the Sith perhaps has more leeway in getting away with this because it was in a unique position, having to conclude both the prequels and bridge them to the original trilogy. And being as we knew enough of what had to happen when we saw it for the first time that we couldn't be too surprised at the ending, instead the film has the atmosphere of building towards a crescendo. For The Rise of Skywalker, the swift nature is because it had to establish so much that the wasted time in The Last Jedi in particular didn't. If you can forgive that though, it makes The Rise of Skywalker a watch which doesn't drag at all and for me felt much quicker than its 2 hours and 20 minutes. The Rise of Skywalker walks an interesting line in relation to The Last Jedi. You can't dismiss it, and yet it strongly is against what that film tried to do. Indeed, Kylo Ren repairing his helmet, but with the visible cracks, is as good a visual analogy for the relationship between the two films as I can think of. Keen not to absolutely write away all impact of The Last Jedi, that film's central scene where Kylo invites Rey to join him, itself a callback to the end of The Empire Strikes Back, is referenced more than once. The X-Wing being present on Acto to be lifted out of the water, again as a reference to Empire Strikes Back, was entirely established in The Last Jedi too, and similarly Rey opting to exile herself there for fear of failure and what she might get wrong is an echo of Luke's reasoning in Episode 8. The closest thing to an outright dig at the previous film in The Rise of Skywalker is it being stated that the Holdo maneuver was a 1 in a million shot, which is why they can't just use it to solve all their worries here. Rose Tico, the embodiment of The Last Jedi and its ethos, is sidelined throughout the new film, and The Last Jedi's big downer at the end, that no one came to answer the Resistance's distress call, is referenced and rejected. For each affirmation of something from the previous film there seems to be just as strong a repudiation. Mostly though, because The Last Jedi spent more time trying to be clever and subversive than actually developing the story, there's not all that much else that The Rise of Skywalker has to do to keep in line with it. The Rise of Skywalker does copy one thing though from The Last Jedi, and that's completely changing the game in the opening crawl. No journey of discovery is required for the essentials, rather Palpatine is back and he's chatting to all the galaxy on the radio. A couple of scenes in and Kylo Ren goes to see him in a scene which, thanks to the strobing light and general gothy Palpatine aesthetic, felt a lot like a death metal music video. There's not really any satisfying reason for why Palpatine's not dead either. He repeats the line from the Darth Plagueis tragedy that the dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural, but beyond some guy in a crowd mentioning the possibility of Sith cloning, that's all we get. The closest we might get to an explanation is importing the now completely non-canon Dark Empire comics into the concept, suggesting Palpatine has cloned bodies which his essence transfers between, but these bodies aren't up to long-term usage. It would explain why he wants to transfer into Rey's body by getting her to kill his current atrophying one, and her being his blood relation makes her suitable for that. This is all inference though, in the actual film it's just left frustratingly vague. The Sith get more mentions than ever as well, far from being the dark side wielders scheming in secret for power and officially limited to pairs as had previously been the case. Now the galaxy and his wife seems to know about the Sith and their language and their runes. As Rey attempts, albeit only once at the start, and later succeeds in summoning all the past Jedi to aid her, so too does Palpatine seem to do so for the Sith. Disappointingly, this amounts to crowds of dark-hooded Grim Reaper-looking folk, rather than some interesting designs or canonisations of the likes of Bane or Revan or Tenebrous. Indeed, as the resolution teeters dangerously on the side of straightforward Harry Potter wand-waving territory, a more creative take on these crowds of spectral Sith could have made the aesthetics and dynamics of the situation much more unique, rather than just offering a stadium of Dementors. The familial relationship between Palpatine and Rey is only one of a number of mysteries that's solved, and yet raises more questions that we'll never really get to understand. It's almost like there was a checklist to run through that was made extra long by The Last Jedi's dereliction of storytelling duty. Snoke is explained at the very start by Palpatine to have been under his control, though we don't get any more than that. Similarly, we now see the Knights of Ren and the irritation that they cause to the commanders of the First Order. It seems to be akin to a bunch of Hell's Angels being given authority over the Kriegsmarine. We still don't actually find out much more about them. My assumption has always been that they're Kylo's fellow ex-students of Luke's destroyed Jedi Academy, but we actually don't know for sure. Now I'd like to address the Mary Sue issue with Rey, which has been a term batted back and forth between the Star Wars fandom schism. Broadly speaking, one side thinks it's a valid descriptor, and the other side's riposte is not usually so much that it's invalid based on the evidence, but that the use of the term itself is sexist and toxic and the rest. I think we can bat that aside by pointing out that the biggest Mary Sue in all of science fiction is surely Wesley Crusher, and it's not the fault of the film's critics that the lead character here is female. My personal view on the Mary Sue thing before this film though was that what most people bring up, her instant and exceptional force abilities, entirely depend on the source of them. Had it been that she was indeed a nobody, as is the answer offered in The Last Jedi, selected by the Force out of nowhere and bestowed with greater abilities than any Jedi previously seen, then Mary Sue might have been an apt description. The other reason for the Mary Sue allegation, which I think would be more valid, is Rey not really failing at anything or being challenged or showing any character flaws. The unique nature of the Force in Star Wars means this point is kind of intertwined with the earlier one. My bigger criticism would be that she's quite bland character-wise in the first two films, though Ridley's performance I think has improved with each entry. The most personality her character was really given that I can recall was the big grin on her face in The Force Awakens when she bypassed the compressor. I think these character issues are ameliorated in The Rise of Skywalker. We do see failure and self-doubt in here, as her carelessness led to BB-8 being damaged, and 2, we briefly thought, the death of Chewbacca. Her easy power in the Force in that latter case was subverted into a bad thing, which I appreciated, and this found its culmination in her trying to strand herself on Ahch-To as Luke had done, and subsequently echoing The Last Jedi in the appearance of his Force ghost to her as Yoda had previously done to him, and then his raising the X-Wing. The Holdo manoeuvre might be able to be written off as a 1 in a million shot for some unknown reason, but there's no way to write around the new ability of Force ghosts to act with power in the physical universe, since Yoda burned down the big tree in episode 8. Another repeated sequel trend is we learn late on about significant things happening off screen. It turns out Luke was actually searching for this Sith wayfinder to lead to Exegol, though he didn't mention it in The Last Jedi. It's a repeat of the same trick as the map to Luke Skywalker in The Force Awakens, which itself didn't really make sense and will be forever unexplained. And that's the case for so much of the sequel trilogy's plotting. Things happen between films, such as Luke Skywalker's map, or the First Order conquest of the galaxy, or the Wayfinder artifacts and the Sith Eternal. It makes it feel like big things have been happening, but you'll have to be satisfied with not looking too deeply if you're going to enjoy it. For example, even aside from the unexplained origins of a map leading to someone who didn't want to be found, logically why even a map at all and not coordinates? I suppose the idea of finding and following a map calls to mind the romance of old-timey adventures, but applied to the galaxy we see in Star Wars, it's just as daft as the Resistance bombers at the start of The Last Jedi, who trundle along slowly rather than attaching their payloads to projectiles, just so there could be a parallel to World War II. It could be argued that starting in the midst of events already underway has always been true of the Star Wars series. The 1977 film began with the Empire and Rebellion already established and the former chasing down a ship of the latter. The Phantom Menace began with the Trade Federation blockading a planet and Jedi seeking to intervene, and then the main story of Attack of the Clones is the uncovering of a plot that's been well underway for years to provide an army just in time for the Republic. Along all these journeys that kick off with events underway previously, the films would go on to flesh out the organisations and main players and dynamics as the stories unfold. This isn't a luxury that The Rise of Skywalker has. The storytelling cul-de-sac of The Last Jedi added a lot of problems for whoever tried to follow it, at the same time without providing much that could be built upon. As such, I'm inclined to be somewhat forgiving toward The Rise of Skywalker for introducing so many things that we just have to accept, as it's probably all that could be done. Though its harmful impact on the story isn't lessened by understanding of the circumstances. The blame though belongs principally to the sequel trilogy's lack of advanced planning and not J.J. Abrams' attempts to salvage it from Rian Johnson's vandalism. As such, while there are certainly many things in The Rise of Skywalker as it stands that could have been improved, I still can't help but like it a bit, just because in recognising how much it had to do, I can also see just how much worse it could have been instead. Unlike the Luke Skywalker map situation, we can invoke Palpatine's planning to explain the clues that lead to Exegol. He knew that those who did find him would be those powerful enough to benefit him. Indeed, it's the only explanation as to why he'd communicate an imminent plan for revenge to the galaxy rather than just invade with his superpowered ships with no warning. It's sketchy stuff really, relying on a lot of coincidence, and as we see Kylo Ren easily shatter one of the Sith Wayfinders, the fact that these trinkets are so delicate makes it all the sketchier. The default answer for things like this can of course be summed up with the phrase, I don't know, it's Force stuff. And Star Wars will always have a measure of that, but the less that Force stuff is relied upon to patch up story issues, the better. The idea of destiny reminds me of J.J. Abrams' own Star Trek 2009 reboot. The hacks who wrote it in later interviews invoked destiny to justify some of the huge conveniences of the film, such as new Spock stranding new Kirk on a snow planet rather than throwing him in the brig, and then new Kirk meeting old Spock and then new Scotty who is taught by old Spock the warp beaming trick which breaks the Star Trek universe just to get them back on the ship. These conveniences were explained away as destiny trying to bring the old crew back together. This may be good enough for those who are just after visual eye candy and base excitement, but it won't sate those who want satisfying storytelling. And while the Force can almost be seen as a baked-in destiny device that can make things that have to happen, for the sake of integrity it should be applied sparingly. Paradoxically, I think the attempt to justify the use of the Force in this way actually led to it being done even more than otherwise, when Finn seems to use the Force to figure out the command ship is now transmitting the control signal, and later he and Janna come to the conclusion that the Force is what drove them to betray the First Order as stormtroopers. By having it happen with others outside of the active Force users, it makes the application of Force stuff for them feel like less of a special case. It could also be a sop to Rian Johnson's attempted democratisation of the Force, which has of course been largely undone by Rey being a Palpatine. So, we learn at the start that Palpatine's been waiting in the unknown regions all this time. The unknown regions have long existed in the extended Star Wars universe, though I think this is the first time they appear in the films. The geographic nature of them and why they're unknown isn't explained here, and the vagueness helps the area be what the film wants it to be, which is somewhere both completely out of the way of all other galactic entities, but also where Palpatine and his cult had the resources to build a vast fleet of Star Destroyers, armed with Death Star level cannons that can take out a planet alone. This goes way beyond established logic, I think. Whether the Death Star needed to be the size of a small moon just to be able to destroy entire planets, we don't know for sure. But the vast size of its dish, which it fired from, would indicate that getting that weaponry down to the size of a Star Destroyer is a miniaturization beyond all reason. In The Last Jedi, after all, the First Order bring a cannon down to Crate, which Finn explicitly calls Death Star tech, and which is just used to penetrate a big door. Considering how many of these Star Destroyers are shown, a little moderation could have been applied. Say for example, half a dozen of them together, concentrating their main cannons fire on a single spot, would destroy a planet like the Death Star. The simplicity of explaining a one-for-one relationship between the old superweapon and these new ships might have been considered to outweigh the overkill from a narrative standpoint, but seeing these ships position themselves to fight together to destroy a planet could also have been made a more visually striking image than when we do see one of these Star Destroyers obliterate a world. An analogue that comes to mind is the immensely powerful Species 8472 from Star Trek Voyager, whose ships would enter formation and combine energy to destroy planets. There is though some possible implied balance for the Star Destroyer's power in the film. Once the new wave of ships joins the big space battle, we see their combined efforts rip through some of these Star Destroyers quite swiftly. The nature of their armament makes them all offence and little defence perhaps, glass cannons as the trope is known. Palpatine's certainty that, upon announcing his existence to the galaxy, the right people would quickly find the two Sith Wayfinders and thus find him, has to be chalked up to the Destiny Force stuff then. There's no easy cause and effect here. We don't know how Kylo Ren found out where to find his, though being on Darth Vader's adopted home of Mustafar I suppose might be high on the list of possibilities, and the one which Rey finds was through reading of Luke's own search writ in his notes, which apparently he thought significant enough to be counted together with the ancient Jedi texts, though as it's about the only thing Rian Johnson left as a possible thread from The Last Jedi, I'll cut JJ some slack on that one. How Luke found out about this Wayfinder we don't know, and I suppose Palpatine must count himself lucky that Luke fell just short of finding the thing and interrupting his plans. On the other hand, that could have made for a much better sequel trilogy. Following Palpatine's initial reveal, we see Finn and Poe on the Millennium Falcon pursuing a lead regarding a First Order informant. I predicted immediately that it would be Hux, and I'm sure I'm far from alone in that. The film has enough to do without introducing someone new, and it builds neatly from The Last Jedi that Hux would do so to spite Kylo. It's nice that Hux receives this involvement. He should have been the Tarkin of the sequel trilogy, but Rian Johnson turning him into a comedy doofus put paid to that potential. But at least he's not merely a pratfalling buffoon here. The introduction of Allegiant General Pride is narratively necessary, as someone older is required to have served with the Emperor directly, and so Hux is deprived of commanding the First Order in the last great battle. That the tension at the prospect of allying with Palpatine's forces leads to Kylo's killing of another First Order commander makes me wonder whether an earlier draft of the story had Hux in the final battle turning the fleet of the First Order against Palpatine's Star Destroyers to help win the day, alongside the disparate ships who come to assist, but that this was discarded as it might run too close to turning Hux into a good guy. It would have made a little more sense, as Palpatine's fleet is destroyed and then the First Order everywhere is overthrown through the motivation gained from the victory. But then I suppose that's only what the end of Return of the Jedi implied as well. The hyperspace skipping at the beginning was fun, though it may not hold up to close scrutiny. The sense of fun established there persists throughout the whole early phase of the film, and much more successfully than in the previous two. The snappy dialogue and little gags all seem to land and help us buy completely into the friendship between the three main heroes, even though Poe only actually met Rey at the end of The Last Jedi. This was the first time in the sequels that I actually really liked all three of these characters. It put me in mind of Han in Return of the Jedi. I've seen some people say that he's not really the same character there as he was in the previous two, but his jokes and quips throughout really establish a sense of warmth between the leads on their final outing together, and they do a great deal to paper over some of the issues in that film. Poe in particular as a character is the big beneficiary of the fun dialogue in The Rise of Skywalker. In the previous two installments he's been tasked with being the cocky snarky one, like a poor imitation of Han Solo. Both Abrams and Johnson took the cheap route to do this, giving him subversive, postmodern, knowing Buffy speak type lines that strain against the conventions. His who talks first to you talk first bit in The Force Awakens was one such knowing and smug nod towards was the fourth wall that thankfully Kylo shut down. Worse still was his prank calling Hux at the beginning of The Last Jedi, undermining the supposed desperate seriousness of the situation, topped off with mocking him as pasty because racial insults are apparently hilarious good guy material so long as they're about white people. In The Rise of Skywalker though, Poe fits very well into the dynamic with Finn and Rey, and the good-natured fun of the piece here is very welcome. I even smiled at "They Fly Now" almost despite myself. The integration of Carrie Fisher into the film was exceptionally well done, to the point I think that if I hadn't known she died and been added in through previous unused footage, I doubt I would have realised. The conversation Kylo has with what I think is just supposed to be a memory of his father felt like it might have originally been planned to have been Leia, as we never see her and Kylo meet properly. Though if I understand the timeline correctly, the bulk of the story, if not the whole thing, was probably written after she died anyway, and so the hand scene may just have been the nearest we could get. Billy D. Williams' Lando is also a welcome sight. He seems to spend most of his time on screen just smiling and laughing as though he's just delighted to be back, but I certainly don't begrudge that, and his presence is a boost to the film. It's more of a shame that we only got the briefest shot of Dennis Lawson's Wedge Antilles. His few-second cameo feels more like an Easter egg, but it's nice to know that he's still around in this iteration of the Star Wars galaxy. Once again, we get the sense that Abrams wants to embrace the Star Wars tradition to its fullest, in contrast to Rian Johnson's subversive approach. Probably the most Last Jedi-like invention that really seems to contradict the previous established logic of the universe is the Force healing, which Rey and later Ben utilises. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to retcon this into a standard Jedi ability, so it can only be part of her inheritance as a Palpatine, a bit like her unexpected use of Force lightning. Going back to the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise, which was explicitly cited near the start of the film, perhaps it forms part of the power Palpatine learned to keep the ones he loved from dying, and Rey has acquired it through him. Considering Palpatine surely loved no one as much as himself, maybe this Force healing he was able to apply to himself to survive beyond Return of the Jedi, but it's all speculation to try to apply these nebulous notions. The heritability of Force power from Palpatine to his granddaughter implies a Lamarckian type of inheritance as well, which doesn't make much sense. Potentiality that can then be nurtured may be heritable, as seen with Luke and Leia from Anakin, but specific powers such as Force healing and Force lightning manifesting themselves without training doesn't match what we've seen previously. What's more, we're not made aware of the man who is Rey's father and Palpatine's son having any of these incredible Force powers. Perhaps Palpatine had a hand somehow in making sure his granddaughter, who her parents after all recognised the necessity of hiding from him, was as powerful as he was in the Force. Again, it's all frustratingly vague. Rey's superpowered Force use also leads to us seeing a tug-of-war with Kylo Ren over the ship, which she proceeds to unwittingly destroy with the lightning. This again is stretching credibility based on previous Star Wars films, though it has been seen in video games where such excesses are more excusable. Even harder to explain away is that a lightsaber can now slice the wing off a TIE fighter, while in episode 7 one couldn't even cut through Poe's jacket. This wouldn't be the last time either in The Rise of Skywalker that we'd see lightsabers do some quite extraordinary things. The implication of the trailer seemed to be that they might genuinely kill off C-3PO in this one. Before seeing him die in The Force Awakens, I had a big suspicion that Han Solo was going to be killed just based on how much he was given to doing it, as though they were making the most of what would be his last outing. Similarly, C-3PO being taken along on the mission and essentially being co-equal with Rey, Poe and Finn at this stage led to the same fear, though as soon as it was mentioned that R2-D2 does his memory backups, we knew there was no danger. Indeed, memory wiped C-3PO led to a few good laughs, such as saying Babu Frick was one of his oldest friends. Put me in mind of the out-of-the-box Buzz Lightyear in Toy Story 2, who accompanies the heroes and who acts like Buzz did in the first film when he didn't realise he was actually a toy. Zori Bliss is introduced, and while as much as perhaps can be done is done to flesh her out, she still suffers a little from being a new character added into an already very busy film. She serves well though her purpose of fleshing out Poe's past, as well as obviously providing a dubious way for the heroes to get onto the Star Destroyer. Indeed, the idea that there's an automatic pass that lets you get onto the Supreme Leader of the First Order's ship with no checks as to who you actually are is probably the weakest link in the whole sequence of events up to that point. If you're willing to forgive it though, it does lead to a particularly neat juxtaposition when during one of their forced Skype sessions, Kylo on the planet realises Rey is actually in his own quarters on the ship. There are enough little moments like this peppered throughout the film to make you realise that J.J. Abrams really does have a gift for that kind of direction, though sadly it isn't always matched by the plotting to get there. The idea that pieces of Death Star wreckage as large as the ones shown were intact after its destruction is also a hard sell, but the roaring ocean that it's set in goes some way to justify it artistically. Indeed, it's the most striking setting in the film, and the crashing waves against the metallic structure make for an excellent visual for a lightsaber duel, a reflection perhaps of the platforms and splashing lava of the Mustafar duel in Revenge of the Sith. This is also the place where we see the promised dark side Rey from the trailer, sadly nothing more than a fairly brief vision, and discover that Sith craftsmanship is lacking when it comes to the durability of their artifacts. We also meet here Janna and her tribe of ex-stormtroopers. With both her and Finn being black, it made me wonder whether there was going to be a plot point here of the First Order particularly taking black children to be made into stormtroopers, but it was discarded probably as it's not something that could really have been done narrative justice within the story, let alone not heavy-handedly, and maybe just didn't fit. The rest of the tribe aren't all black, but Janna, being the lead one, was probably cast earlier. As it stands in the final film, one of the First Order commanders around the table is a black lady, so racial politics is firmly left out of it, which is a good thing. Around the time of Rogue One's release, which roughly coincided with the 2016 US presidential election, one of that film's writers, Chris Weitz, who was a constant critic of Trump and his campaign, declared that the Empire was a white supremacist organisation, and following that there have been the various political readings of elements of The Last Jedi, as well as the social justice warrior droid in Solo, so the absence of that kind of thing in The Rise of Skywalker is to its relative credit. All roads lead to Exegol then, where the frustrating vagueness reaches its apex. The space battle is one part of it, though it's not quite accurate to call it a space battle as it takes place low enough in the planet's atmosphere to be breathable and have enough gravity for the horses to be able to charge along. Probably it was set there just for that purpose. We saw the horses briefly in the trailer and I didn't expect it to be much good, but in the finished product I thought it made for a cool idea. A bit like the lightspeed skipping, it may not necessarily stand up to scrutiny. For example, atmospheric conditions and any ship movement up that high would surely make it impossible for the horses to stay upright, never mind gallop, but equally maybe the ship's own shields compensate for that. Even harder to work around is the navigation tower business. The point seems to be to delay the final order fleet from being dispatched by interfering with communications for long enough that others arrive too and help take them all out. But the idea that fleet-wide communications are reliant on obvious target towers seems to be a convenience of the plot, even as it tries to cover it by having the navigation control transferred to an onboard tower, and the whole thing ultimately being a delaying tactic rather than a crippling blow. In the interests of not merely nitpicking, but offering an alternative, considering that this is a hidden planet unknown on previous charts, perhaps its location being obscured by space anomalies that require particular technology for large ships to get through, and disabling that technology could have been a more logical option. If you're going to have such a vast fleet, you will run into the trouble of how to hold it up with an obviously underpowered opposing side, where a single target is needed to deal a blow to them all. So far as the encounter between Palpatine, Rey and Kylo goes, the intent seems to be that Palpatine and Rey act as figureheads for this greater battle of the Force realm, and as such we see the aforementioned Dementor Sith looking on. Rey's attempt near the start of the film to commune with previous generations of Jedi pays off here in the resolution. We've never seen any Jedi attempt to do this before, or any mention of it, so my guess is it's something mentioned in the Jedi texts, particularly for when things are desperate, which with Rey and Leia left as the only Jedi in the galaxy, they are. Palpatine sucking their life energy makes sense, as much as that kind of thing can. His founding myth, the Darth Plagueis tragedy, was all about the nature of life and avoiding death. When it comes to firing Force lightning, previous experience with Mace Windu and Darth Vader would seem to indicate that it can be tough to stop once initiated in the heat of battle, if not carefully controlled. Repelling it by crossing two lightsabers though, that's another one we have to work hard to justify. Whether lightsabers inherently have a relationship to the Force hasn't been stated previously. It's been my previous belief that the way the Force allows the Jedi to comport themselves with increased physical dexterity is what made lightsabers the unique weapon of choice for them. We see Mace Windu use his lightsaber to turn the Force lightning back on Palpatine in their confrontation, but then we also see Yoda do the same with just his hands against Count Dooku. So my understanding was Windu was channeling his own Force ability through his lightsaber rather than the lightsaber itself having a particular ability to use or enhance the Force. It seems to me that the ultimate dark side Force user, powerful enough to fire lightning into the sky to take up multiple ships at once, shouldn't just be defeated by adding an extra lightsaber blade to bend his lightning back at him when a single one wasn't doing the trick. Perhaps being the lightsabers of Luke and Leia, it's the imprint they've left on these objects that makes the difference. Indeed, as they are the children of Anakin, that might go a little way to resolve the big problem that bringing back Palpatine creates, that it undoes Anakin's defeat of him and return to the light in Return of the Jedi, which before Disney took over was the culmination of the entire Star Wars episodic saga. Having Palpatine return without nullifying Anakin's entire story isn't easily done, and it's only by applying personal interpretations that we might attempt to make that work here. The film doesn't do it for us. As the battle becomes explicitly all about the Sith versus the Jedi though, we get to hear the voices of many of the past Jedi, which is great, though sadly as with the Sith we don't get to see them. A possible way around not negating Anakin's defeat of Palpatine is to say that this battle takes place even more in the Force realm than it initially seems, such that Palpatine and Rey aren't so much calling on their respective sides in the Force realm, but rather those sides have invested themselves into those two. The collective Sith have chosen their ultimate champion in the figure that was their culmination, and who did come to rule the galaxy for over 2 decades. Since we've seen that Yoda in The Last Jedi ripped up the rulebook about how Force ghosts could act in the physical realm, maybe it took the will of all the spirit Sith to reconstitute Palpatine for one final and ultimate confrontation with the Jedi. For the Jedi, their true champion and only means of defeating the Sith was to get behind Palpatine's own grandchild, to keep her in the light, because only a power which came from Palpatine could defeat him. This of course teeters heavily into the category of Destiny Force stuff, but seeing this as an altogether more cosmic final confrontation, and the last gasp of the dark side to conquer the light, might help the situation as regards negating Anakin and Vader's story, though not entirely. There would still be a symmetry here. The Emperor in Return of the Jedi presented an unwinnable situation for Luke. Either he strikes out in hate and attacks Palpatine, or kills his own father and so yields to the dark side that way, or Vader defeats Luke and the previous status quo is restored. What Palpatine didn't envisage was Vader siding against him and with his own son, and so killing Palpatine not out of hate, but out of mercy and love. The Sith were destroyed because one Sith turned to the light and destroyed the other, and did so not in hatred but to save someone else. Ultimately it took a Sith to destroy the Sith. Similarly here, it takes another Palpatine to destroy Palpatine. The Emperor is more powerful than any Jedi we've seen, and so the collective Jedi could only defeat him via the genetic inheritor of his own power. Another parallel to Return of the Jedi's resolution is the more obvious way that Palpatine is defeated in The Rise of Skywalker. Palpatine is happy for Rey to kill him, as he can then transfer his essence into her being his blood descendant. Alternatively, if she's killed, then the one person who can defeat him is gone, so it seems to be win-win for Palpatine. Because Rey dies concurrently in defeating him, he can't transfer to her, and it's only in Ben giving up his own life to force heal her that she lives again. Ben's doing so may seem to contradict my earlier guess that Rey's Force inheritance from Palpatine is the reason she has the unique ability which we haven't seen in Star Wars before now. So we'd have to add the additional rule that one person who's received Force healing from another can repay the favour. The initial act creates a link, and so it can be done in the other direction. It does kill Ben to do so at least, so it isn't cost free. What's more, the Reylos got their kiss as well. So, is the character arc for Kylo Ren convincing? Well, Kylo Ren for me in all the films is a strange case. On paper he's a pretty poor character, a self-obsessed emo constantly blathering on about feeling the pull between the light and the dark, like a teenager trying to choose between My Chemical Romance or Slipknot. Immense credit is due to Adam Driver then, who manages to still act his heart out in the attempt to make it work. The received wisdom seems to be that Kylo is the best new character in the sequels. I'm not sure I can say that in good conscience, but Driver far and away gives the finest overall performance. The sequence of events that finally turned him to the light in this film, the vision of his mother, followed by his stabbing and then healing by Rey, followed by the memory of Han, and finally casting his lightsaber away, and then ultimately giving his life to save Rey, draws on enough archetypes I think that there's enough there for most people to find something to connect with emotionally, though as we see him doing his fair share of merciless brutality just in this film, Driver's acting skill and Abrams' directorial capability do much to cover up the fact that this is a sudden late game face turn for Kylo. As it stands overall in the trilogy, Kylo Ren has been a lackluster character who has benefited hugely from being portrayed by an extremely talented performer. The film's close is very subdued as Rey travels to the Lars homestead on Tatooine, and we get a cute echo of when we first saw her in The Force Awakens as she sleds down the sand there. I generally didn't listen too much to the reports of leaks that would pop up on the likes of Reddit and YouTube, but I'd heard enough to know what the last line was supposedly going to be, as Rey declares herself to be Rey Skywalker. Hearing this alone before seeing the film sounded like it was going to be the usurpation of Star Wars history by the Mary Sue character who, having triumphed through her own brilliance that outshines anyone else we've ever seen in the series, bestows upon herself the name Skywalker. Instead, her powers have been explained as being inherited from the galaxy's biggest villain, and she's been through emotional turmoil because of this and other failures in the film. As we see Luke and Leia's ghosts, we realise that this isn't Rey taking the Skywalker name for herself, but rather her being adopted and accepted by them despite who her grandfather was. That, ultimately, is much more powerful and moving than I had any expectation of anything in this film being after the previous two entries, and is a good thing for people to relate to. Despite its flaws, and there are quite a few to be sure, it's things like this that make The Rise of Skywalker so much better a film than the rest of the sequel trilogy. Also, one other thing, that new droid, D.O., the unicycle hairdryer looking thing, was adorable. I think the impression we're meant to get is its shy politeness and responses were meant to indicate its introverted personality is due to abuse from its previous owner, but that's too nasty to think about. Things like the Porgs or even Baby Yoda have little to no appeal to me, but D.O. I find impossible not to like. My feeling then is that as a conclusion to the sequel trilogy, The Rise of Skywalker is better than the two previous instalments deserve. There are certainly improvements that could have been made, though the balancing act to keep it a fun action film means for the good of the entire piece there are bits of explanation and exposition that have to take a hit, particularly when so much is introduced that's new while the film also has to tie up the 9-episode saga. For me though, it doesn't do enough to repair the damage to Star Wars wrought by the other sequels, or justify enough their inclusion alongside the first 6 episodes. Though where The Rise of Skywalker is at its best, this is a close run thing. It's ultimately let down by that frustratingly vague nature of the Palpatine stuff, and that, for all my theorising and headcanon attempts, I can't get beyond the negation of Anakin's redemption arc that Palpatine's survival here seems to undo. That I'm even inclined to try to make the Palpatine stuff work, though, is an indication of how much goodwill the film built up with me before that point. The Rise of Skywalker, for all that I sincerely like about it, ultimately is too little too late. I do admire its ambition though, and unlike the other two sequels, I do look forward to seeing it again. While The Force Awakens played it too safe and The Last Jedi played it too stupid, a real attempt was made to make The Rise of Skywalker count, which makes those places where it still falls short all the more frustrating. Perhaps a break with the trilogy tradition and the splitting of this film into 2 parts and giving us a 10th episode would have afforded the space and opportunity to really develop what The Rise of Skywalker tried to do. As it stands, The Rise of Skywalker to me is a noble attempt, no more and no less. Since seeing The Rise of Skywalker, I've tried and mostly succeeded at steering clear of other reviews and analysis so I could give as pure and uninfluenced a view as possible of the film. My YouTube recommendations at the side of every video I watch have been stacking up with various reviews of it, so now I'm free to dive into those at last. I'll be curious to see if there's anything I missed that others picked up on, or vice versa. If you have any thoughts or disagreements or things you think I missed, do please leave a comment below. Before The Rise of Skywalker came out, I made a couple of videos with predictions of what might happen and how the film might perform. I'm not going to claim I predicted it, but there are some interesting commonalities, so I think in my next video I'll explore that and look at what I got right and wrong there. If you've enjoyed this, then I'd be really grateful for the like, and also if you'd be willing to subscribe. This is still a new channel, and so all of that kind of thing is a really big help. This is Jonathan from Headhunters Media, and I hope I'll catch you again soon.